Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So last week in Parashat Kedoshim, we spoke about the fact that being holy is not something that we are, but something that we do or we become. Right? Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy. It's not an inherent aspect of us. As a matter of fact, we have to work at it. And to some degree, the Parasha last week then went into telling us how to do that, mainly in terms of how we treat other people. And I would argue that Parashat Emor, this week's Parasha, is an extension of that, but first we deal with how to be holy with other people, and now we talk a little bit about our relationship with God. And yes, it connects back to people as well, but Parashat Emor has two distinct sections. The first, actually, is focusing a little bit on the priesthood and how we as human beings connect to God, relate to God. And the second, starting chapter 23, is actually a part that we read very often in the year. It's the holidays. It talks about the different holidays. So we wind up having three different sections focusing on holiness. Last week, holiness with people. This week at the beginning, holiness vis-a-vis God. And now, at the end, we have holiness vis-a-vis time and our calendar. So what I want to speak about today actually is the second section, because we speak about holidays a lot, actually, at the holidays. Right? We tend to look at this parsha because we read it. And I want to actually turn to the very end of chapter 22. So you can look at page 723 in the larger books, the Humashim that are in front of you. And it says, Ushmartem mitzvotai, you shall faithfully observe my commandments. I am the Lord. And then it says, Lo techalalu et shem kodshi. You shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified in the midst of the Israelite people. I, the Lord, who sanctify you, you have brought. I who have brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, the Lord. And I want to talk a little bit about that command, Lo techalelu. You shall not profane my holy name. Now, it's interesting because I remember growing up as a kid, we're told, especially here in the United States, based on the Ten Commandments, you can't use God's name by saying, gosh darn it, but using, God's name instead, right? You can't do that because that would be taking God's name in vain. Now, that's one of the differences, actually, between the way that Christianity reads this and the way that Judaism reads this. Judaism actually looks at that commandment very specifically as do not swear an oath or a vow by God's name and then not fulfill it. Right? That's the way that commandment, do not take God's name in vain. If you're going to use God's name to swear an oath, which is the way that oaths were sworn in the ancient Near East, right? You invoked your deity, and that kind of puts behind, hey, you better do it. We Jews did the same thing, right? We would use God's name to swear an oath. Well, then you had better do it. It's not don't say the name of God, right? Or don't use it in a non-prayerful way. But then we get to this, which changes it a little bit. And the words are different, right? Lo techalalu, you shall not profane my holy name. And I guess that's my question for us to think about today. What does it mean to profane God's holy name? What does that mean? Mike?
Well, I have a bit of a question. So the Hebrew word
Lechalel means to, profane, to denigrate. You could say to curse, right? Chilul Hashem, you could say that. It's not exact translation, right? Chilul Hashem is a desecration of God's name. So to desecrate, to profane, to denigrate, right, are all words, synonyms that we could conceivably use to translate this word.
So that to me it might mean don't put God down, don't say, oh, it's God's fault.
Oh, interesting. So you actually gave two different answers. I like them both. So let's talk about both of them. The first is don't put God down, right? But the second is, in essence, don't blame God. Don't say it's God's fault, right? Especially for the things that we do, right? We love to blame other people. Let's throw God into there too, right? So maybe you're arguing, maybe that's what it means. Good, Marge.
So those two things to me mean
Don't disrespect God, okay? And how do we, is the way that we show respect to God different than the way that we show respect to people, or is it the same?
made in God's image, so I think there's a lot of similarities.
So there could be similarities, right? There could be similarities. And maybe that's why last week's Parsha and this week's Parsha are sort of connected a little bit, right? The way that we treat people and the way that we treat God, there's some connection there. They're not in completely different sections of the Bible. Okay? Anyone else?
I think sometimes we try not to, but sometimes we sort of do live in binary spaces, or we're taught in a binary way. And when I was growing up at yeshiva, we were taught everything you did was either a Kiddush Hashem or a Chilul Hashem.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And that was it. And I mean, obviously there probably is some space in between. So I would say a Chilul Hashem was basically, if it wasn't a Kiddush Hashem, if you weren't doing something to sanctify God's holy name, then it was probably a Chilul Hashem.
Very good, very good. So coming from the yeshiva world, the Orthodox world, I agree with this. I think in the modern world and in progressive movements, I think we do read it a little bit differently. But I like how you're describing it. From that world, it's very binary. Everything is either a Kiddush Hashem, a sanctification of God's name, or a Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. And there's nothing in between. There's nothing in between. And actually, I would argue, and we're going to come back to it, I would argue that they got it from this very pasuk, right? Because this pasuk creates a binary situation, right? You shall not profane God's name that I may be sanctified, right? So it creates that binary situation here of, right, if you're profaning God's name, then God's not being sanctified, and if you're not profaning God's name, then God is being sanctified. So it's one or the other, it seems, here. Okay, Tom?
We were talking about the oath earlier. I was thinking that we don't try to lower God to our level, we try to rise up to his.
Okay? I like that. So we don't lower God to our level. We try to elevate ourselves up to God's level. And perhaps that attempt to bring God down to our level would be what we're talking about here, a Chilul Hashem, to demean, to denigrate, to desecrate God's name. Okay? Anybody else? So let's see what the rabbis do with this, right? Rashi, our greatest Torah commentator, is very conventional in how he deals with this, right? Lo techalalu, right? La'avor et devarai mezidin, right? What does it mean to willfully go against my commandments? Not just, oh, I've made a mistake, right? Because people make mistakes. Human beings make mistakes. But b'mezid, willfully, right? To willfully say, I'm not going to do. This is not what I'm going to do. I know I should. I know that's how I was raised. I know that's what I'm supposed to do. But nope, I'm not going to do that, right? And then he and some of the other rabbis connect it to a very specific situation. So that was sort of the general situation. And then he connects it to the situation actually of martyrdom, right? Of martyrdom. Of, you know, there is a time when you are being asked or demanded of you to desecrate God's name because there are people that are forcing you to do that. And he says that with very, you know, with a couple of exceptions, we don't do that, but there are exceptions where we do. And when God's name is being desecrated, usually when it comes to idolatry, or when it comes to murder, or when it comes to the forbidden, you know, incest and those sorts of things, it's better to preserve God's name and not do that and die as opposed to and become a martyr. And so they connect it, interestingly enough, to that, and they get very, very specific. But I don't think that's what the pshat of this text is. I think the simple meaning is much broader. Okay? So Sforno, another commentator, reads as follows. Seeing that you are the priests, right? He's speaking now specifically to the Kohanim, and are more aware than anyone of the perfection of my works, if you do not take care to deviate from my commandments, this would be the greatest desecration of my holy name. So what's Sforno saying here?
Is he talking specifically to Kohanim, or is he talking to the Israelite people who are priests to the world?
Yes and yes, right? I think he's speaking specifically to the Kohanim because that's the chapter that's here, but I think he's also giving a broader message. So what is that broader message? Right, let's take the specific and then go to the broad. The specific message is, you priests know, right? You know how we're supposed to live. You know what God's law teaches. If you don't take ultimate care in the way that you live, in the way that you behave, in the way that you act, that is more so of a desecration of God's name than just your average person, right? And look, I mean, we see that today. We see that with clergy in all denominations, whether it be Jewish clergy, whether it be Christian clergy, right? The expectation is we're leading the life that we're preaching. And if we're not, right, that loss of trust, that deflation of who, you know, of what the religion represents when somebody who's supposed to be living that way doesn't, is a lot greater than the average person. Okay, so I think that's part of it. But I like what you said, Mike, in terms of the second piece, right? And we talked about this last week. We are called an Am Kadosh, an Am, right? A people, a holy people, and a people of priests. So we, as the Jewish people, also have this relationship with God, have this relationship with our text. We have to act a certain way. And when we don't, it's all the more so for us. Right? It's all the more so for us. We feel it. I remember when Bernie Madoff and all of that, right? When somebody gets arrested, especially for financial crimes, because it goes into all of these anti-Semitic tropes of money and stuff like that. It's like, oh, please just don't make them be Jewish. Let them, you know, because that sense of, oh my goodness, what is the world going to say, right? Is there. It's there. Okay. Anything else before we move on to the last piece? Yeah, Marge.
Isn't it kind of like modeling? Like
Yeah.
parents would model, right? So it's kind of step down, like parents model, and they would older children model.
Right. It is modeling. It's absolutely modeling, right? How do we model this is what we say, this is what we teach? We have to model that. Absolutely.
I think what you were talking about, if this goes to the last piece, just
Go ahead.
interrupt me. So we were talking about Chilul Hashem versus a Kiddush Hashem. We also talk about Hamavdil being Kodesh L'Chol. We're always talking about the separation. Like And that's when they start talking about the blasphemer.
Right.
Which is like really, really, really bad. That was like a capital crime. It was so bad. So they're going from the klal to the prat to what, and then this is how, and it's like, this is really, really high stakes, folks. Like, don't.
So it actually does connect into the last piece that I'm saying. So let me just, I'll summarize and then I'll move into it, which is what you're saying is that lo techalel, right, do not profane, actually connects in sound, not in root actually, but in sound, to the word that we'll get later on at the end, which is lo tekalel, which is do not curse, right? Do not curse, and that's the blasphemer. And all of this is really, really high stakes. And this actually brings us to Rabbeinu Bachya, right? Rabbeinu Bachya writes as follows. Desecration of the Lord's name is the most serious sin. There's a lot of different sins out there, right? But Rabbeinu Bachya is saying, wait a second, this one is the worst, right? We find that on occasion, God ignored the sin of idolatry while not ignoring the sin of desecrating God's name. What's he saying here, right? Idolatry, we know, is one of the top three, right, that we're never supposed to do. And yet, he argues that there are times God let idolatry slide, but not a desecration of God's name. That's how important this is, right? Our sages in Yoma state that the sin of desecrating the holy name of God is not one for which the Day of Atonement brings forgiveness. So, even Yom Kippur isn't going to get you out of this particular sin. This is as big as it gets, guys. I mean, this is huge. This is huge. So, what ultimately does he argue is the antidote then to desecration of God's name? Anybody want to guess? Say it louder. Sanctification of God's name, right? And that's why he argues both of them are actually in the same verse here. It's not that it's a binary piece where it's only one or the other, but there's a connection between the two. That the only way to combat a desecration of God's name is the sanctification of God's name, right? And that's something that I want us to really think about for a moment in today's day and age. I'm going to let you say one thing, and then I'm going to finish up what I want to say. Go ahead.
No, this isn't what you want to say.
It's okay. Go.
I was connecting it to what's happening right now in the college campuses.
Yeah, please.
Without going too far afield, no pun. But you see in these tentafadas all these bad things, and they're making a big mess of everything and whatever. And then on the other side, you see the quote counter-protesters. I wouldn't even call them protesters. Jewish people with the Jewish flags, and we're singing Am Yisrael Chai, and you see people putting on tefillin, in the midst of all of this stuff. And then you see the Chabad people, they're giving out Shabbos candles and all kinds of stuff. That's the Kiddush Hashem.
So that is where I want to go with this, and I agree with what you're saying, and I'm going to shape it a little bit differently, which is, I think right now, right, we are dealing with so many different issues that attack who we are, that attack the goodness sort of in this world. And the question is, how do we respond? Now, what you're saying is, what we see on a lot of these campuses is a very positive response, but that's not the only response. And I think the warning here is how we respond is just as important as whether or not we respond, right? A chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name, right, requires a response, but it requires a response from a place of Kedusha, from a place of sanctity, from a place of holiness. And so, yes, that is true. So you see at my alma mater, right, UCSD, very, very close by, you see the difference between, calls for intifada and what we just had this week from the pro-Israel students of Peace in Israel Week. It's a very different mindset of why it is that they're there. Now, we also have seen the opposite, and we've seen people go from our community and cause trouble and cause damage and actually act in the same way that they're acting. And that's a problem. Because if we're going to go back to the binary, if it's not Kiddush Hashem, if we're not acting by bringing sanctification, by bringing holiness, then we are aiding in what is going on there. And so it's really, we are faced right now with so many challenges. And it is so easy to act the way that we have been acted upon. It's very human, right? It's reactive. Somebody does something, somebody pushes me, you push back, right? That's the human response. And by no means am I arguing that we shouldn't respond. But we need to think about how we respond, and we need to respond from a place of Kedusha, from a place of bringing God's name up in this world and showing what it is that the light and what we can be, as opposed to the opposite. And I encourage us as we look at these next couple of weeks and we find ourselves in places where we're face to face with somebody who is speaking something that is very difficult for us to hear, how we respond is incredibly important. And it's either going to be a Kiddush Hashem or a Chilul Hashem. It's our choice. Shabbat Shalom.